environmental law showing up as a perspectives course. It is a perspectives course, and there are other things out there. I think it's just they're still working out all the bugs in the automatic audit system, making sure everything's gotten internet. But as long as you pass the course, you're meeting the perspectives requirements. So don't worry. All right. So continuing on, us talking about perspectives, we're talking about environmental justice, and we left off with the very sort of last pieces of some of the legal issues with respect to environmental justice. So in terms of federal environmental statutes and regulations, remember we have the executive order, and environmental justice is supposed to be incorporated into both the mission and the decision-making of federal agencies. So that is presumably an opportunity for agencies themselves to consider environmental justice when making their decisions. It also provides opportunity in rulemaking, in notice and comment rulemaking, for a couple things. One is particular outreach to historically underrepresented or marginalized or under-participating communities that might be affected by proposed rules. But also, the environmental justice groups, such as the one that you're representing, can submit comments, participate in that notice and comment rulemaking, and call particular attention to the environmental justice impacts of proposed rules. And so that's a significant opportunity there. There's also consideration of environmental justice impacts in permitting. We talked about some examples of that. The air permit for Shintech, hazardous waste site facility siting permit in Kellerman City. There have been lots of permits where the impact on environmental justice communities, low-income communities, communities of color, communities that have a disproportionate burden of environmental harms have been considered in the permitting process and in the conditions that are imposed in those permits, the mitigation measures, and so on and so forth. It also is an opportunity, again, for environmental justice groups to have input, but with both rulemaking and permitting, it requires that the environmental justice group be aware of the proposed rules or the proposed permits, and have the organization, information, resources, etc. at hand to be able to participate effectively. One of the things that can happen, of course, is not only information gathering by the environmental justice group that can have a significant influence in this, but also through mobilizing members of that community to have their input, as opposed to it just being solely by the executive director or lawyer for the group, for the environmental justice group itself. Okay, so the more people, the more residents participate, presumably that shows a fair amount of interest in the issues. As we've studied, federal environmental statutes and regulations also can lead to litigation against the agency for its actions. If the actions are, again, just to remind you the standard, arbitrary and capricious, an abuse of discretion or otherwise not in accordance with the law, that's the sort of the APA standard, and you can then attack particular actions under particular statutes. And also inaction, where the agency has a non-discretionary duty to act. So, for example, if the agency is failing to regulate some sort of pollutant that's harmful to human health, and that is particularly affecting your client, your community that you're representing, then you can bring a citizen suit claiming that the agency has failed to perform a non-discretionary duty under the statute. Of course, with all of this, you have to establish standing. There has to be a final decision, right? The final decision, there has to be, in addition to there being a final decision, it has to be ripe, and you have to have exhausted administrative remedies and the like, okay? And standing, I assume you can, we're not going to kind of go over all that, but I did mention the other day that a lot of times with environmental justice groups, if there is some harm to their health or directly to their neighborhood, it's easier to establish standing than, say, the group that says, hey, I love butterflies, and now and I go out into nature and I try to look for butterflies, and your government action is going to, harm the butterflies and so forth. That's obviously more direct if it involves the health of the community residents, if it involves their property values of their neighborhood, etc. Citizen suits are also allowed under certain circumstances that we've talked about throughout the semester against regulated parties. Okay, and I want to be careful here. We mean polluters, but not entirely. Sometimes what they're doing isn't polluting per se, but against the party that is required to comply with the environmental laws. And if they don't, the environmental justice group, if they're going to be harmed by that, again, they have to have standing. They have to be a group that's going to be harmed by the regulated party's non-compliance or under-compliance. Then they can bring a suit depending on the statute. And so we have some examples under the Clean Water Act, we have some under RCRA, and so forth. But remember, there is, with almost all of these, there's a requirement that you first of all, you can't bring the lawsuit against the regulated party if the government agency is taking action against the regulated party. So if the government is taking action, then you got to let them do their thing, which, of course, for an environmental justice group is somewhat frustrating, because a lot of times the government enforcers may be more lax, more accommodating of the regulated party than the environmental justice group would like to see, because, of course, the government regulators aren't living in the community that's being polluted or whatever. The other thing is that even if the government is not taking action, you have to give them an opportunity by providing notice and waiting before you bring your lawsuit. So if the kids in your neighborhood are being exposed to something really bad, right, even if it is an endangerment of human health, say, for example, under RCRA, you still have to wait the requisite period. You still have to give the agency and the regulated party notice, and you have to wait because the idea is presumably we'd rather see them voluntarily come into compliance than to have it litigated in court. As you can imagine, with both types of litigation, we've sort of talked about them in general, but we haven't really talked about the reality that these are very long processes. The litigation processes in environmental litigation take a lot of time, okay? Often these are in federal court. The federal courts have lots of different lawsuits before them. These are often complex, technical, multiple parties, etc. And there are other things that oftentimes the courts have to deal with. Federal courts are subject to a Speedy Trial Act for people who are in custody for criminal offenses. And so the courts have to give that priority. And there's, of course, reasons why that is the case, but that's not very reassuring to, again, people in communities that are suffering a lot of environmental harms and burdens and would like to see the law enforced against the agency and the regulated party. So, we're going to talk a little bit more about this with the outcomes in just a second. The other thing I want to just emphasize, though, before we get to outcomes is the environmental justice is a concept, of course. We have a definition, we have law, we have executive order, and various ways in which agencies consider environmental justice perspectives and so forth. But probably more than anything, environmental justice is a movement. And I talked about it being sort of a grassroots movement, and it has become a national network to some degree. There's even some international networking of groups that are concerned about environmental justice. But more than anything, when you see activity in the realm of environmental justice, sort of the social and political movement part of this is key. The community organizing, information sharing, political activity, lobbying, publicity, protest, input into decision making, etc., participation in various processes and so forth, is actually probably even more significant in terms of where we see actual outcomes than any specific piece of law. Okay, so the law is certainly important enough, but it's probably not as robust. The law is not as robust in the environmental justice area as the movement itself is. Okay, so as a social and political and rights-based movement, environmental justice is pretty significant. And as I pointed out earlier, the sorts of issues that the environmental justice movement has tackled has really grown. It's gotten into things like, parks and trees and transportation and all sorts of things like that, as well as sort of more traditional pollution and waste sites and so forth. Have we seen any results? Are there any outcomes? Well, I think it would be fair to say that environmental justice is certainly considered in environmental decision-making, environmental policy, environmental regulation more now than it was in 1980. By probably quite a good bit. I mean, there's certainly much more awareness of environmental justice issues. There's much more attention. There's more analysis, right? And so just in terms of being aware of the issue and considering it, there is more of it in environmental law than has been the case. There have been a couple of systematic studies of federal agencies, and what federal agencies do is the executive order really having any effect. And the reports, so there's one that was done around 2000, and then there's one that came out maybe about 2 weeks ago. For the one that came out 2 weeks ago, the General Accounting Office interviewed me, among other people. So there was a whole big environmental justice conference in DC a year ago, last April, and so they interviewed all of the speakers at that conference and a whole bunch of other people. They interviewed, hundreds and hundreds of people for this, and then they did sort of systematic analyses of the policies and regulations and decisions of all these federal agencies. The bottom line is it's actually pretty disappointing. Okay, so even though every agency is required to have environmental justice in its mission, only half of them do. Okay, and that's just in the mission itself. In terms of does it actually affect decisions, there are some notable examples where it does, but for the most part, environmental justice is not really shaping decisions by federal agencies as much as the executive order would say on its face. Okay, so and you're you've been in law school long enough. You can create this language in a rule, and then what that language actually means in practice or implementation is something quite a bit less rigorous than that. And so that's sort of the general gist. So there's the EPA actually got pretty good marks this last time, back in 2000. Interestingly enough, it was the U.S. Department of Transportation that was probably doing the most with respect to environmental justice, and the EPA had not gotten as engaged. And so, but there are a lot of agencies that really are not doing, not doing nearly as much. It's a lot of lip service, a lot of broad aspirations, and not a lot of substance. So that's a concern, and we certainly continue to see lots of evidence of environmental injustice. I think it would be fair to say that the incidence of polluting facilities or waste facilities being located disproportionately in low-income neighborhoods of color has pretty much mostly disappeared. Not entirely, but you do not see nearly as many siting decisions that are being made. Now, part of that is that the number of siting decisions has dropped off. I mean, it's much more costly to create a hazardous waste facility. There's all kinds of liability associated with that, right? Nuclear power plants. I mean, when have we last had a licensing of a nuclear power plant, right? I mean, that there's a lot of ways in which our environmental regulations and our concerns about the risks associated with this, public opposition, and so on and so forth, has made a difference. There was a time back in, I think it was primarily the 1980s, where maybe 1980s and 1990s, where one study showed that there was disproportionate siting of TSD facilities in Latino neighborhoods, but not in Black neighborhoods, and their analysis tended to, I mean, wasn't definitive, but it tended to show that a lot of Black communities were more organized coming out of sort of the civil rights era, whereas Latino communities, primarily immigrant, primarily concerned about sort of not being as engaged or as visible politically and legally, were arguably easier targets. So that's been that's been a phenomenon. Some of the other good studies looking at which factors are most highly correlated to a TSD facility being located or sited in the neighborhood is that there's an inverse relationship between political participation, particularly voting rates in that neighborhood, and the likelihood. So that, of course, that makes some sense. The more politically involved the residents of the neighborhood are, the more likely that they're going to be able to push back against the facility. If they're less involved, the decision makers are simply just less responsive to the residents of those neighborhoods. One other sort of significant issue that has at best mixed results is that the environmental justice movement has primarily been a critic and sort of a vocal critic of the mainstream environmental movement. Okay, so the environmental justice movement has basically said the mainstream environmental movement is largely interested in wilderness. It's largely interested in middle to upper income white people and what they want and so forth. And if you look at who they are, who their staff are, who their members are, who's on their board, that is, it's primarily about representing the interest of not of lower income people, not of people of color. And so there are some groups that have made a move towards this. Probably the group that's done the most, the mainstream group that's done the most is Earth Justice. They've been very intentional about this. Other groups, not so much. So I might have mentioned this before earlier in the semester, but for a few years I was on the board of trustees of the Kentucky chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And I was the vice chair of the board, and one of the things that I did was help push them towards an urban conservation program as part of the tree canopy planting stuff that we're doing here, and so that was, I thought, worked out pretty successfully. What I was not at all successful at was trying to get them to diversify. So in all those years, I mean, I think it's still true, it may have changed very recently, but for many years, they seem to be unable to, or unwilling, I think actually is probably the more accurate, to have any people of color join their staff or be on their board. And I find that remarkable that, of all those staff people, I mean, it's not a tiny staff. I mean, of all those staff people and of all those board members, they all had to be white. Just seemed to me astounding. So I'm sorry, I'm probably editorializing there, but it shows you to some degree part of the problem, right? That if you are, here, we'll just use example here, if you are somebody who is black and low income and live in West Louisville, or Latino and low income and live in South Louisville, what kind of belief might you have that the Nature Conservancy would care about your interests whatsoever, right? I mean, just think about that. I mean, that's right. They doesn't look like you, and they're not seeming to do anything that is focused on your neighborhood or your interest. So that has continued to be an outcome problem in the environmental area. One of the things that all this suggests, though, is that perhaps to some degree environmental justice is more likely to be accomplished, or more can be done to pursue environmental justice if it's not limited to environmental law. Environmental law seems to be an important factor. Okay, so one of those things where we say necessary but not sufficient, right? Necessary plays an important role, but it seems to me that what we see here is a lot more focus on activism, on empowerment, on gathering more information and sharing that information, on building partnerships and networks with others, and collaboration, finding resources to invest in improving environmental conditions in these EJ neighborhoods and so forth. And that seems to be key. There has been for some time a bit of a what's the word I'm looking for, tension between members of environmental justice groups and environmental law, because they feel like, especially in the litigation area, the lawyers take over their struggle from them, so it's no longer their struggle, but now it becomes, the lawyer's legal strategy. And you, right, you've been in this long enough that you know, right? This is exactly what we train you to do, right? To basically take over, and right, everything's a legal issue, right? And there is there is no shortage of people who are relatively assertive and confident in law school, right? Or in the legal profession, right? There are lots of people who are like, I'm going to get in there, I'm going to file the suit, I'm going to develop this strategy. And of course, that's, and to some degree that is needed. But the other thing, of course, is the scientists and engineers and the technical experts who also believe that they have all the answers. and that they're going to tell the community what needs to happen and so forth. But the point is that members of these communities feel like both law and science are disempowering. Law and science are disempowering. And so that's something that you need to think about if you are working in this field, is how can you be, how can you be more client-centered? Okay, we talk about client-centered lawyering a lot, but sometimes it's a vague concept. And what I'm suggesting here is that being more client-centered is important. We'll come back to that. So I'll come back to that probably next week. All right, questions about any of this? No? All right. So now we're going to turn to climate change, and we're going to get to environmental justice here, but possibly not till the beginning of next week on the climate change issues and climate justice. So 5 issues that we're going to cover here. Why is climate change controversial? What is climate change and what are its causes? What are the effects of climate change? What can be done about climate change generally? And what are the environmental justice issues and strategies involving climate change? Those are climate justice issues. Now, having said that, there are a whole bunch of slides. This is like 90 slides in this presentation. There are a whole bunch of slides. Yeah, I see you guys are looking at me like, holy, yeah, whatever. So anyway, so the thing is there are just lots and lots of slides about the trends in climate change, okay? So we're going to pass through them pretty quickly. You can look at them at your leisure when I post them on the Blackboard, okay? So don't feel like, we're skipping them too fast. They'll be there for you to take a look at. All right. So there are 3 issues regarding the science of climate change. Okay, is the climate changing? Are humans causing it? And what should we do about it? Okay? And each of these is a separate issue, but sometimes what happens in the societal and political discussions about this is they get all mixed up. So people who have particular perspectives about what should be done end up shaping the dialogue or the discourse about, is it happening or are humans causing it? So to some degree you get resistance, okay, denial, it's not happening because I simply don't want to have to quit driving my car. I don't want the government to tell me that I can't drive my car anymore. Okay, so that ends up being part of it. Or the other end of the spectrum, oh my gosh, this is awful, there's all these things happening, my kids and grandkids aren't going to have a future, so therefore it's clear that humans have totally destroyed the global atmosphere. Well, neither of them are particularly scientifically sound. Okay, so that's part of the where it gets all mixed up. When we talk about what we're going to do, also there are a lot of options. Mitigation in this context means trying to stop or reduce or reverse or slow climate change, the causes of climate change. So basically to pull back from our what we're doing here. So that includes reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, sequestering and storing greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, taking them out, holding them. Adaptation is another alternative. We simply need to adapt to climate change because it's happening. We're going to have more drought, more flood, rising sea levels, heat, pests, and so forth. And that raises lots of questions about who's going to do this, how, to what extent, and at what cost. So one of the things that sort of can end up shaping controversies over climate change are just plain out and out cultural, religious, or philosophical rejection of science. Okay? So that's one of the things that's going on here. For our purposes, for environmental law, the legal system has embraced the science as highly relevant to figuring this out. All of the Supreme Court justices, from the most liberal to the most conservative, have accepted the argument that there is such a thing as human-caused climate change. That's not really a debate in the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay. Now, what ought to happen and who has what responsibilities and what does the law require or allow is a totally different thing, but just is it happening, and do we actually trust the science, that's really not being questioned in the legal system per se. So from our standpoint, we're sort of starting with some other things. So, but just because the existence of climate change and the fact that there are human causes of it is scientifically accepted does not mean that there's agreement even within the scientific community about things like how much, what rates, where the actual tipping point is, where it becomes irreversible, etc. And so there is a fair amount of disagreement about that. And then also there's a fair amount of disagreement about exactly, if we do X, what will happen? In other words, what will the results of our various policy choices or human actions to address climate change be? And that's because we have a whole variety of different models out there that you end up, and what we're doing is we're projecting out in the future. There's a fair amount of uncertainty to all this. Remember, we talked about stationarity is dead. The past is not a very good predictor of what's going to happen. And so there are a couple of things. One is there's a risk, a really pretty significant risk, that we're just driving right over the edge of a cliff, right? That we're going to get to the point where we do pass some sort of threshold. So that we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But that's one of the concerns, and there's some scientific reasoning and scientific evidence behind them. But then there's also some scientific reasoning and evidence that says, nature's actually relatively resilient. There's more bounce back than the alarmists seem to suggest, and so maybe it's not as bad. And we have evidence on both sides in other areas where, so for example, when we destroy wetlands, the functions of those wetlands are really very difficult to recover in the future. Okay, so that is an example where probably human actions have environmental consequences that are worse than what science anticipated at one time. On the other hand, reforestation is a much more common thing than people thought. People thought if you cut down the forest and you develop the land, okay, that then the forest is lost forever. And you will never get those functions back. Well, it turns out that if you abandon your land development and just let the land sit, you get a certain amount of reforestation. Some of it is only moderately environmentally beneficial, but some is actually pretty good. Okay, so again, that has surprised scientists. So it actually tells us again. So there's some suggestion either way that you could have better outcomes than suspected or worse outcomes than suspected. And we're dealing with models here that are making a set of assumptions. In addition, there get to be some blurring between the scientific research and policy advocacy. And it is not at all surprising that scientists who do research in this area are alarmed, and so they therefore do things like write to their members of Congress, or participate in climate change protests, or that kind of thing. But sort of the classic example of why all this gets so confused is there were 3 scientists who did some sort of scientific study about some of the it was generally in the area of the tipping points. It wasn't exactly, but just for our purposes, that's kind of the gist of it. And they said, basically, the government needs to do the following three things. The science shows that the government needs to do the following three things. This is a crisis, and so forth. Well, that's not, that last part, the government needs to do this. That is a value choice, right? That is a policy choice, and it might be true. It might be you guys are saying, hey, we don't all want to have a horrible global environment. This is going to be serious effects on human health, on ecology, etc. That might be true, but if our political system chooses to destroy the environment, that is a political choice. There's nothing about the science that says you can't do that. Basically, the science says if you do that, the following bad things will happen. And so, that's what science is about. But what happens is then the science then shifts into policy advocacy and policy preferences. We've talked before about a lot of these problems are very complex, and the science on its own just can't resolve deeply divisive value decisions. Okay? So that's part of the sort of challenge of all this. But as I mentioned on the first day of class, we're going to operate on the assumption that climate change is happening, it's human caused, and what we're going to do is look at what's going on here. So this basically says that for the most part, the composition of the Earth's atmosphere does not have these things here: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, and CFCs. Those are all the greenhouse gases, and it just doesn't have that many of them. Okay? So in comparison to all of the gases by volume in the atmosphere, greenhouse gases just aren't a very big percentage. But as they grow, their effect is significant. Okay, so this is what happens. So you have the natural greenhouse gas effect, where you have solar radiation. It comes, it comes through the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere to the Earth, and you get some. It bounces off of things on the Earth. It gets sort of sent back out into space, and that's sort of supposed to be how it works. And some of it comes back. It goes back and forth, back and forth. But basically, the idea is that it's going to be a whole lot less than comes in, but still, the natural approach is lots of it returns into space. When we have a greenhouse effect, and this is just, it's really what it says. It's like a greenhouse, where you have the light that comes in, right? And it keeps the greenhouse really warm and moist because it doesn't go back out. It doesn't radiate back out. And so the more greenhouse gases we have, how they work is to hold that heat and that radiation in the atmosphere as opposed to letting it go out. And so then that warms the atmosphere, and it also often increases the moisture in the atmosphere. Okay, and as the book pointed out, okay, you can kind of see where Mars has really almost nothing in the way of atmosphere greenhouse gases. It's very cold, and Venus has a very thick atmosphere with lots of CO2, and it is more than 420 degrees Celsius on Venus. So that's the part of the idea here. So this is just this is a diagram that shows different ways in which we have affected the overall amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in terms of how much is going into being held by things like vegetation, land, ocean, and how much is being generated by our various activities. And you'll have access, you'll have access to all these slides. And so this is just another representation of what's going on with that. And I'm not going to get into the numbers. I mean, it's just, that's mind-numbing. So it was, besides that, right? We all chose law, right? I mean, so if you like numbers, you take Professor Blackburn's classes, but otherwise we'll stick with sort of broader concepts here. All right. So this is again a representation of things that are going on and changes. So decrease in glaciers, decrease in snow cover, increases in land temperature, increases in sea level, loss of Greenland ice sheet, increases in temperature over land and ocean surfaces, increase in humidity, increase in sea surface temperature, decrease in sea ice, and increase in ocean heat content. And so those are the trends that we've been seeing since, their various time frames. So some graphs. This is partly designed to show you that the anthropogenic effects, the human-caused parts, are in this steady increase, whereas other possible explanations like solar radiation, El Nino, and volcanic activity is variable and not going up the way that we see the temperatures going up, or the ways that we see the amounts of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere going up. So this is increasing global temperatures. You see the pattern there. This is projected change in average annual temperature. This is what happens. So this is an explanation as to why, despite what is supposedly warming, we have these polar vortexes. And it's in part because we have these warm air masses that push up against the sort of stable polar vortex, and then that means that it is basically, just think about if you like plop down on a waterbed, right? It's gonna, you go up, you go down, some other part goes up, and so that's kind of the idea here. We get so Louisville gets this massive polar vortex that comes down, whereas historically that wouldn't have happened very often. Here's our unprecedented increase in CO2 in the atmosphere since around 1950, compared to the past 400,000 years apparently. Here's a monthly carbon dioxide concentration going up every year since the 60s. This is measurements in Hawaii and Mauna Loa, which actually just makes me think we should all go to Hawaii, skip finals, right? Here's historic rise of CO2 levels in a different kind of graph. This is, again, the Earth's carbon budget, and showing different relationships between the amount going into the atmosphere and the amount being absorbed by the Earth. Increase in methane concentrations, increase in nitrous oxide concentrations, changes in ocean temperature. This is surface temperature changes, precipitation changes, lake levels facing decline. So this is Great Lakes, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron. Sort of massive drop off after about 2000 or so. Okay, average sea level worldwide. Okay, and you just see, you see the pattern, right? It's the same kind of trend all the way around, right? Arctic temperatures, right? Again, the same thing. Arctic temperatures going up. Sea level rise in New York City. The measure of the sea level in New York City has been going up. Right, big increases. Here's past and projected changes in sea level. Sea ice, okay, it's the opposite. It's a sharp drop off in sea ice, right? And by the way, a number of these slides are a few years old. It's actually even worse now, right? And you see the stories on the news. In fact, I think I don't know about y'all, but you become numb to them, right? It's like, another big, massive loss of Arctic ice or Antarctic ice or Greenland or something like that. And after a while, you're like, I've lost track of them because, that's reported all the time. And so, we can become numb to them. So this is sea ice loss. This is this is about the various gases, how much of different sorts we are generating. Here, again, I'm not going to, you can take a closer look at this if you want, but they're all going up, okay? They're all going up. So this gets at some of the international issues. So in absolute terms, what are the rates of increase in fossil fuels that are being emitted, okay, of carbon dioxide emissions? And so China, as you can see, has had a substantial growth. The U.S. was on a growth pattern for a while, and now we're dropping off some. The EU didn't grow as much, but now it's dropping off. And India is growing, it's a lot less, but it's growing at a more substantial rate too. This is per capita. So this shows that in the U.S., okay, now here's a little bit of a attention. Okay, so the U.S. has the most per capita generation of greenhouse gases, other than, I think, Australia. Okay? So we have the most, but our per capita generation of greenhouse gases has actually been dropping off pretty sharply. Okay? So so as we move to alternatives, as we become more efficient with everything going from LED lights to more fuel efficient cars to all sorts of things, our per capita is dropping off, and so forth. Of course, one of the challenges is, of course, China's is growing, India at a less significant rate. And that is a challenge because as the world population grows, right, if you have substantial population growth in nations where there's also substantial growth of per capita greenhouse gas emissions, that's just going to be quite a bit more in the future. Okay? This is per dollar. This is various sources. So you see coal is quite high. It grew a lot, but it's been sort of trending downwards. Oil is continuing to grow. Gas is continuing to grow. Cement's growing, but it's obviously a lot less significant factor. This is global energy usage. So globally, oil and gas are growth areas in terms of usage. Coal is dropping off globally. Okay, so that is, and we talked about this all the way back, very beginning of the semester, dealing with Martin County, and one of the challenges of Eastern Kentucky is it is primarily based on a resource extractive economy that is on the decline. Okay, that's the reality of what's happening there, which raises a whole variety of environmental issues. Here is sector. So power generation has been on the decline. Transportation is up and down sometimes, but mostly on average pretty flat. So this is another total global emissions. This is demand growth in Asia. Okay, this is the per capita. You see Australia, and then the US, then Canada, and so forth, and all the way over to India. So India has a fair amount of growth in its generation of greenhouse gases, but it's because it has an enormous population growth and economic growth, that kind of thing. But in terms of per person, they're actually pretty small generator. Okay. So one of the things is that one of the questions is, to what extent is our economy based on generating greenhouse gases? I mean, so we sort of have this idea that we have this fossil fuel dependent economy, but actually this is called global decoupling. That globally there's trends are moving in opposite directions. So world carbon dioxide emissions are flattening while GDP keeps growing. Okay, and in the U.S. it's even more so. Okay, so that is significant. Tells us that alternatives have started to be a significant part of economic productivity and economic growth and so forth. We're not totally fossil fuel dependent. This is California. So then now what we turn to is, what are the effects of climate change? So this slide, you may have to sort of expand it, the magnification on the screen. I borrowed a lot of these things from other presentations, but there's a lot here. So obviously sea level rise, precipitation, temperature. Okay, those are the big climate, the three big effects of climate change, which then in turn have secondary effects on human health. Weather-related mortality, infectious diseases, and air quality respiratory illnesses. On agriculture, such as crop yields, irrigation demands. One thing that's not there, but that we've talked about, is shifts in ranges. Okay, so what have historically been crops that are pretty substantial summer crops in the lower Midwest, or the sort of central band of the United States, are eventually going to well, it's starting to happen, but the predictions are that we're going to see those in like Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Okay, so because those places in Canada are going to start having longer summers, warmer winters, etc. For the most part. Obviously we'll still have the polar vortex incidences, but just overall. Forest, changes in forest composition, the geographic range of the forest, the health and productivity of the forest. Substantial effects on water supply, water quality, and competition for water. Coastal areas are going to have erosion of beaches, inundation of coastal lands, additional costs to protect coastal communities, and species are going to have loss of habitat and loss of species, and there's some significant effects on species in the areas that depend on glaciers and ice caps and so on and so forth. So we're already seeing that with polar bears, right? And if you want to be sad, you find the YouTube videos that are out there about the starving polar bears and so forth, because they simply know too much of their ice has melted. Okay, and so all right. So this is an example of the shrinking of the Arctic ice cap, and again, it's worse now. Okay, so this slide is a few years old. It's worse now. This is not the most recent fire near the Getty Museum, but this is the fire that was up by the Santa Monica Mountains and Malibu that ended up being very close to the Getty Museum in Los Angeles and UCLA and so forth. And so you see the people fleeing on the freeway and so forth. So more wildfires. Okay, so the incidence of wildfires and the severity of wildfires in California are way greater. Okay, so again, you just look at the trajectory, it's the same kind of trajectory. Heat, we've talked about urban heat island effects and the causes of heat and so forth. Of course, the sort of concept behind the effects of climate change have to do with systems that flip, that suddenly change from one to another, just like the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, or other sorts of things where you get these sort of adverse effects across systems, and they force the system into a different kind of system. So for example, what we talk about as the eastern Kentucky forest warm, and as there's migration of species and migration of acorns and seeds and conditions, heat and precipitation and so forth, those are becoming or going to become more softwood forests rather than hardwood forests. So that's the kind of flip of system function that we see. Another has to do with coastal environments, and these are two pictures from St. Augustine Beach from 10 years ago in St. Augustine Beach, where the erosion of the beach, right? So you see, here's the sand dunes here, which they've now protecting with seagrass, but this, you see where it's all cut in, okay? They are losing the beach at a rate of less than every 3 years now. It used to be, took 10 years to have a beach erode, and now it's less than every 3 years. So that's a significant change because of partly sea level rise, but also because of storm surge and other kinds of more intense storms and so forth. This is the Shoreline Change Project that was at issue in the Massachusetts versus EPA case, which was about how Massachusetts was trying to deal with the fact that that its shoreline was going to change dramatically over time. So they have a 30-year projection and a 150-year projection, but showed significant migration of the shoreline and erosional hotspots. So since we're on Massachusetts versus EPA, these slides sort of illustrate some different ways of thinking about the causal process. So the very simple one is greenhouse gases cause climate change, cause changes in the atmosphere, which in turn cause impacts on coastal lands. Okay, a little bit more nuanced, which is exactly what Massachusetts was alleging in Massachusetts versus EPA, and the majority opinion accepted as adequate to establish causation is EPA fails to regulate greenhouse gases from vehicles. That causes more greenhouse gases to be emitted than if they had regulated, which contributes to, in some portion, climate change, which in turn contributes to sea level rise, storm surge, and erosion, which in turn causes impacts on coastal lands, which is what Massachusetts was complaining about. This is the dissent view of what the causal process was, which is, okay, here's greenhouse gas emissions, and the EPA's failure to regulate is one of the contributors, but there's also failure to reach international agreements, congressional failure to legislate, other greenhouse gas sources, and the vehicles themselves. And this in turn, so here's greenhouse gases. There are other causes of climate change other than greenhouse gases, and so that's climate change. And then there are a whole variety but here's climate change having impacts on coastal lands and resources, but there are also natural causes. Land development plays a major role, so there's a big synergy between the climate change and land development in coastal areas. Other public policies, natural resource management, and so forth. And so they're saying that the impacts on coastal lands and resources are actually caused by a whole lot of different sources, not just the EPA's failure to regulate. So that's the view of the dissent. Another sort of perspective here, climate change affecting water. There are going to be variations over time and variations from place to place, but in general, we're going to find that the western part of the United States is going to become drier, and the eastern part of the United States is going to have a whole lot more flooding. Now, having said that, we're also going to have extreme flood events in the west, and there was a sort of outrageous example of that in El Paso, Texas, where like a whole subdivision washed away because they get the extremes. So it's very dry, and they don't have any rain, and it's a drought, and so on and so forth. It goes on, and all of a sudden they have this massive, severe storm with very large amounts of rain falling very rapidly, and their land can't absorb it because it's, A, it's all developed, and B, it's too hard and compacted from the drought, and so you get these sort of severe effects there. That whole subdivision washed away. By the way, this is I think this is Prospect up there. By the way, it's flooded, and this is in Kansas, which is not the far west. I mean, Kansas gets a decent amount of rainfall, but that's a river that almost pretty much dried up. That's normally pretty widely flowing. So that's going to affect our water resources in lots and lots of ways. And already, okay, so some of you may have been paying attention to the news. Places in India, the plain just ran out of water, right? And so that raises a whole variety as we get to climate justice issues. Okay, so what can be done about climate change generally? So one thing that we've sort of focused on are international agreements. So go back to the Kyoto Protocol. Okay, the book talks about that. So there we have a major breakthrough internationally, an agreement to, first of all, for nations to adopt mandatory limits on greenhouse gas emissions, but yet also some variation on obligations between developed and developing countries. In other words, that more would be expected of developed countries, and developing countries would have more flexibility and more opportunity to develop, as opposed to just saying, okay, now you can't develop the way we did, and so forth. And so then we've been through a whole variety of different agreements that have either built on the Kyoto Protocol or replaced the Kyoto Protocol. And the most recent is the Paris Agreement, or the Paris Accord, which, as you probably have seen, the U.S. is planning to pull out of, to withdraw from. Okay? The thing about the Paris Agreement is that, for the most part, what's happened is nations have stepped back from mandatory obligations. What they have agreed to is reporting and transparency. They've agreed to try to reach certain targets, but it is not mandatory that they do so, and there's really no penalties if they don't do so. So it becomes much more a peer pressure kind of thing. If we have all this mandatory reporting, we have all this transparency, every nation has agreed to cut back in order to prevent anything more than a 2-degree increase in the atmospheric temperature, then presumably all these nations will feel pressure. There'll be sort of peer pressure. Okay? The reality is that nations have political incentives to appear to do something without really losing the economic benefits and the economic growth that comes from continued generation of greenhouse gases, right? I mean, that's a sort of basic bottom line here. Some nations have more of a political and social and cultural commitment to reducing their greenhouse gases, to seeing this as a shared problem. Other nations don't. I have a friend who teaches at another university who went to the latest, it was not Copenhagen, it was, I forget, it was in Poland. Okay, it was the latest round of all of these international meetings. And his response was, I am never going to be involved in trying to address climate change ever again because it's never going to lead to anything because this is all political. And she said, I came here and I was totally disgusted because even among all the environmental advocates and all the climate change activists and the nations that say they want to do something, it was all just politics. And I guess my reaction is, what did you think? I mean, okay, these are nations that have strategic interests. They're going to behave strategically, right? I mean, that's how nations behave. And so hopefully we get some shift in global values and awareness of this as a global problem. But the reality is international agreements are kind of not doing a whole lot. So photo op. Everybody can cheer and join hands and raise their hands and so forth. But the reality is, this is the Kyoto Protocol, but the reality is we're not doing much. And this, by the way, is just a question about which trajectory are we aiming for. So the baseline is the red one, and the 2-degree scenario is the purple, the magenta colored one, and the gray one is what the scientists want, which is 1.5. Oh, and by the way, that was another thing, is that it was all political and the scientists ended up, well, they weren't ignored, they were listened to, but then the science didn't end up shaping the actual outcome. So some other things. One is the use of federal environmental law to control greenhouse gases. That's where we get Massachusetts versus EPA. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Public trust doctrine and nuisance law. So we're going to talk a little bit about the atmospheric trust litigation cases and so forth. State statutes, but by the way, both of these are turning out to be really pretty limited in terms of any mechanism to force either governments or contributors to greenhouse gas emissions to actually do anything. State statutes, regulations, and management. I passed out something some time ago when we were talking about changes, how environmental law is changing, that looked at private sector reduction of greenhouse gases and also local governments. So what both the private sector and the local governments are doing. And by and large, whether it's right or wrong, whether it's going to be enough or not, those two sectors are where the bulk of the action is happening. Okay, so what we call subnational governments, local, state, sort of not at the national level, subnational governments and private sector, business, industry, changes in consumer behavior, that kind of thing. Local land use planning and regulation is another option, and that's especially relevant to adaptation issues. The intersection of federal and state and local planning and regulation. So one example is the Coastal Zone Management Act. The Coastal Zone Management Act is a federal statute in which Congress provides funding to coastal states if they adopt coastal zone management plans that meet federal standards, okay? And there's not, actually, I mean, it's a condition of the funding. There's not really a whole lot of regulation. This is not really command and control regulation. What it is really an incentive system. What happens is the local governments and the state governments do adopt zoning and planning regulations in accordance with their coastal zone management plans. But basically what it is this is cooperation between the federal government and the state and local governments to achieve some sort of systematic planning to protect coastal zones. And so there are some good things that come out of it, but it's also not, I mean, you're not like to sue anybody for violating the Coastal Zone Management Act, or you're, you know, I mean, if Tampa chooses to allow some big massive hotel to be built on the beach, there's no federal law against it. But it's less likely that's going to happen, or it's more likely that if the hotel gets built on the beach, there's going to be sand dune protections and seagrasses that are planted and other kinds of things that are done because of this. And then, as we've talked about before, watershed planning and management. So we're going to just touch briefly on the Clean Air Act. And I'm going to go through this pretty fast. Your problem does not involve the Clean Air Act or air quality, but but it's hard for you to sort of figure out what's going on with climate change if you don't at least understand what this is about. So federal statute requires regulation of air pollutants, requires permits for air pollution. It is a sort of partnership between the federal and state, just like the Clean Water Act. There is regulatory authority delegated by the federal government to the states, and it's created a national, uniform national standards. So, of course, typical things, the air pollutants get identified and categorized, and there are limits on the basis of how much pollutants, depending on the different types of pollutants. We regulate the end of the pipe or stack. So we basically say, hey, you can only emit so much of this from your facility. In addition, there are national ambient air quality standards that are set, and localities are either called attainment or non-attainment, depending on whether they're meeting the NOx for their community. Louisville is non-attainment for several different pollutants. It is pollutant by pollutant. So we're non-attainment for both types of particulate matter, and I'm forgetting what else, but I think we're non-attainment for maybe 4 different pollutants. There's health-based standards, technology forcing standards, etc. States have to have implementation plans. One of the key things is stationary sources. These are, industries and facilities are regulated differently than mobile sources, which are vehicles. Existing sources have a standard called prevention of significant deterioration, which is different than new sources, which have more rigorous standards called new source performance standards. Again, just a context, help you understand what's going on here. So you learned a whole lot of Clean Air Act in just like 5 minutes. Okay. Part of what the controversy is that the Obama administration, okay, so we have Massachusetts versus EPA, and that said, hey, the EPA has to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from mobile sources, okay, so that was going on. But the question is, because stationary sources are in a different section of the Clean Air Act, was there any authority or duty for the EPA to regulate stationary sources? And so the Obama administration came up with the Clean Power Plan, okay? And this is just a map showing what kinds of reductions would have to be achieved. The Clean Power Plan has been subject to a lot of litigation. Attorneys general of a number of states, including Kentucky. Okay, so our Governor-elect Beshear was part of the lawsuit against the Clean Power Plan. Okay, so why? Because Kentucky, Kentucky generates a lot of it has a lot of coal-powered utility plants, right? I mean, so it's not, it's not in Kentucky's interest as a state to agree to this, to buy into this. So there's all this litigation. So it's been primarily stayed by the court, and meanwhile now the Trump administration is in the process of repealing it. So this leads to some general observations that there are some really significant barriers to using federal environmental laws to try to force regulation of contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, okay? So we saw kind of a wave of that, Massachusetts versus EPA. It was very exciting, Clean Power Plan and so forth. But when we actually come down to it, now it turns out that's not being especially effective. So where we will start at the beginning of class on Monday is looking at public trust and other lawsuits, and then we'll finish up with green and blue infrastructure, which is actually a lot less law. It's more just sort of conceptual, or more policy, and then we'll.
Yeah.
I don't know what happens there. And like I'm interested.
Yeah.
I don't get it. Only class. Big goal! What's up, man?
Hanging in there. Yeah.
Are you doing PR?
Falling, and after you finish the series, I've been doing everything that I'm very serious about. After you get to the end, they show you how it was filmed, and there's an episode about how they filmed that thing. They had their camp on this bridge on this land side, looking at this glacier, and they thought it was gonna happen, and got to the last day of filming, and they helicoptered over this huge wave while it was crashing stuff. It's very cool.
Wow.
It's sad. It's graphic.
Yeah.
Demonstration of all of it.
Thank you, man.
Well, that's
I
one
need
of
it.
the challenges. Is
I'll
like,
see
No
you.
panic.
sort of teaching
You'll
and
be
writing
fine.
about this is so
Thank you.
at some point,
I'm
sometimes I go home and I
probably
just
gonna
don't
go
read
to
the-
Starbucks real quick and then come back.
Yeah.
I can't watch
Yeah.
it anymore because it just
It's
makes
just
me
a lot,
sad.
yeah.
But
Well,
no,
most of
I
the
will.
other Planet Earth stuff
Wonderful.
isn't
Okay.
specifically
You'll have
about it,
time.
but Frozen Planet is very
And then
much.
Friday morning.
But I want to figure it out. My plan is.
No, I will totally.
If I don't know
What
by
time is your
Friday
exam?
morning,
Like 3?
1 p.m.
They moved it up to 1?
Yeah. If I don't know it by Friday morning,
You'll be fine.
yeah.
Your exam,
PR.
PR.
Environmental.
Excitement. Yeah, I think so, yeah. Listen to you.
Have a good weekend.